Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki, Sharma, Upadhyay. Let's get started. Do you know the game of poker? Here are the basics. You have to keep your cards close to your chest. You have to keep the other players guessing. To win, you either bluff your opponents or hold the best hand at the end. That's called showdown. Why am I telling you about poker? Because Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden are playing it at Ukraine's expense. They're building up the threat of war and keeping the other players guessing. Putin mostly, he's a pro at this game. Biden has made some gaffes and given away a lot of his strategy. He's not ready to get his hands dirty, and his allies won't back him 100%. But he's not meeting Putin's demands, so the threat of war continues to grow, along with the build-up on both sides of the border. European powers are betting on talks. They depend on Russia for energy security. They have more at stake than the US then. They cannot upset Putin. But talks have been on throughout this build-up. What will it take to strike truce? Does Russia have the appetite for war? Is Ukraine any match if NATO soldiers do not join this war? On Gravitas tonight, we'll bring you the full story of what's being called the biggest military showdown in Europe since the Second World War. Also on the show, India celebrated its 73rd Republic Day today with a grand fly-past and a spectacular parade. What's the message to young India? We'll bring you a special report. Pakistan is broke. It has raised $1 billion through Islamic bond at a record interest rate to keep its forex reserves afloat. Is Lithuania diluting its Taiwan policy under pressure? Reports say German big business is piling on the pressure. And on Australia Day, the country is having a fierce debate. Are they celebrating an invasion? We'll explain. We begin as always with Gravitas Global Headlines.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson faces the heat in Parliament yet again as he expects to receive a damning report into Downing Street parties during lockdown. Johnson reiterates that he will not resign and insists his government gets the big calls right in his handling of the pandemic. The US advises its citizens to reconsider any travel to India amid the pandemic, even as America registers twice as many COVID cases and surging deaths related to COVID-19 when compared to India. The advisory comes while COVID cases continue to decline in India. A court in Iran has sentenced a French man to 8 years in prison on spying charges. His lawyer denounces the trial as a politically motivated sham. Benjamin Briere has been held in Iran since May 2020 when he was arrested after flying a helicam near the Turkmenistan-Iran border. The Omicron variant of COVID-19 is set to slow down the global economy, says the International Monetary Fund.
We've downgraded global growth to 4.4% this year.
The Washington-based crisis lender cuts its world GDP forecast for 2022 to 4.4%. The biggest drag on the global outlook is the sharp slowdown in the US and China. The US Coast Guard launches a search for 39 people reported missing for several days after a boat capsized off the coast of Florida in a suspected human smuggling case. A SpaceX rocket, which launched almost 7 years ago, is on a collision course with the moon, warn experts. The Falcon 9 booster, launched in February 2015, has been following a chaotic orbit since running out of fuel on its mission. Tropical storm Ana kills at least 46 people across Madagascar, Mozambique and Malawi after making landfall earlier this week. Nearly 115 homes in Mozambique have been completely destroyed, say authorities. Heavy snowfall and clogged roads has stranded thousands of people across Turkey and Greece. In Athens, thousands were evacuated from a motorway overnight. Meanwhile, stranded passengers protested at Europe's busiest airport in Istanbul. Title favorite Daniil Medvedev produced a stirring comeback against Felix Auger-Aliassime to reach the semi-finals of the Australian Open. The de facto top seed fought back from 2 sets down against the world number 9 and also saved a match point to reach a second straight semi-final in Melbourne. The Russian will now save 4th seed Stefanos Tsitsipas, who eased past Jannik Sinner. Women's 7th seed Iga Świątek booked her place in the semi-finals of the Australian Open with a batting win over Estonia's Kai Kanepi. The 2020 French Open champion rallied from a set down to complete a 4-6, 7-6, 6-3 triumph. She will now face 27th seed Danielle Collin after the American ended Elise Cornet's dream run to reach a second semi-final at Melbourne.
Is Russia planning the largest invasion since World War II? The US says that's what the West will be up against if Russian forces invade Ukraine. Let me show you the build-up. This video was shared by the Russians themselves. This is a Russian base. Weapons are being dispatched. What's inside the trucks? Most likely short-range ballistic missiles. In the next frame, the action shifts to the front. This is Russia's border with Ukraine. You see soldiers, tanks and missile launchers. For the next 3 days, Russian troops will train for combat like this. Russia has surrounded Ukraine on 3 sides. More than 100,000 troops are deployed. Drills have begun at 2 locations, southern Russia near the Ukraine border and the Crimean Peninsula. This includes the Black Sea. 6,000 soldiers and 60 Russian fighter jets are involved. And that's not all. Russia has sent more defense equipment to Belarus. What is the build-up for? Russia insists it has no plans to invade Ukraine. But experts say war strategies are in place and Moscow is exploring 4 options. Number 1 is punitive strikes. Russian forces can leverage their greatest strength, their weapons. Moscow can pick targets and pound Ukraine from a distance. They have the means to do it. Long-range artillery, rocket and cruise missiles, they have all of it. Russia can also conduct airstrikes. What about sending troops inside Ukraine? That brings me to option number 2. It is called the fabled land bridge. We're talking about this highway on your screen. It is called the M14. It runs along the Azov Sea coast between Crimea and the Russian border. This is a strategic highway for Ukraine. It is part of 2 major transport corridors. The highway also links 2 major ports of Ukraine. If Russia takes over this highway, it could cut off a vital road link for Kiev. Then we have option number 3. This is a multi-pronged offensive. As the name suggests, Russian forces could strike multiple Ukrainian locations. What are the possible targets? Cities like Kharkiv and Luhansk. These are in the north, and Crimea in the south. The plan is like an old-school offensive. Russian forces could just cross the border and attack. The final option is going after Kiev. taking over the Ukrainian capital. This would be extremely difficult, A, because Russia would need a massive force to overwhelm the Ukrainians, and B, because several high-profile targets like the important government buildings are on the hills, so they're easily defensible. But essentially, Russia is spoiled for choice, 4 options. Which way it goes depends on how the West proceeds. Last week, the foreign ministers of the US and Russia held a meeting. Russia made 3 clear demands. 1, no NATO expansion. Number 2, no NATO membership for Ukraine. And number 3, a rollback of all NATO deployments from eastern Ukraine. Now, these are all sweeping demands. In the past, the US and its allies have refused to accept them. And there's no indication that they will change their stand this time. But Russia is threatening retaliation now.
Мы не дадим. Если конструктивного ответа не последует,
if a constructive response does not arrive and the West continues its aggressive course, Moscow will, as the President has said on more than one occasion, take the necessary retaliatory measures.
An invasion into Ukraine is by no means going to be easy. It will mean a bloody conflict and huge losses for both sides. Kiev says it is already being destabilized.
We can say 100 times per day that invasion is imminent, but this doesn't change the situation on the ground. And what we currently see is a scenario of destabilization of Ukraine. And that scenario is certainly imminent. It's already taking place by spreading panic, by putting pressure on the Ukrainian financial system, by conducting cyber attacks against Ukraine.
Ukraine's friends in the West agree. They're sending weapons. The US has dispatched another shipment. Ukraine now has American anti-tank and bunker-busting missiles. European powers are deploying their militaries. Denmark is sending fighter jets to Lithuania. A Danish frigate has also been dispatched to the Baltic Sea. France has offered to send troops to Romania. Spain is sending a frigate to the Black Sea. The United States and NATO have already put troops on standby. But like always, conditions apply. The West is not going to send soldiers into Ukraine.
No intention of putting American forces or NATO forces in Ukraine. But as I said, there are going to be serious economic consequences if he moves.
No soldiers, but serious economic consequences. Nobody is running for cover after Biden fired those words. Europe, meanwhile, is betting on talks. Paris is hosting an important meeting. It is called the Normandy format. Advisors from Russian and Ukrainian governments are meeting. France and Germany are playing mediators. This is not a high-level dialogue. No ministers are involved, only government advisors. So not very much is expected. But French President Emmanuel Macron has his own reasons to stay invested.
You're correct when you say that the results of the Normandy format talks are not matching the expectations and the involvement France and Germany have placed in them. However, giving up or renouncing is acknowledging that the political situation is no longer on the table. And so I believe it is important for us to stay tirelessly invested.
So what's the end game here? European powers are trying to create an opening, a room for negotiation. Ukraine looks willing to talk to Russia. Kiev is making concessions, in fact. It has dropped a controversial bill, a bill that was designed to target rebels in eastern Ukraine. Now, these are groups who fought with pro-Russian forces. The bill proposed to ban them from holding public office. And by dropping this bill, Kiev is sending a signal to Moscow. They don't have to go to war. So talks continue along with the build-up, but a truce is unlikely without America's involvement. Moscow wants specific commitments from Washington, D.C., and Biden is unwilling to budge. Do you know what the US president desperately needs right now? A crystal ball to see the future, to read Vladimir Putin's mind, because right now Biden's policy has no direction. He's trying a bit of everything, you see. Talks, troops, military aid, sanctions. It's like shooting in the dark. There is only one constant in Biden's strategy. He doesn't want to dirty his hands. In other words, Joe Biden will not send American soldiers into Ukraine. This was the big question on everyone's mind. Would America directly fight Russia? On Tuesday, Biden clarified his position. This is Ukraine's war, he said. America will cheer from the sidelines, but it will not get involved directly.
Just to be clear, there is no intention or interest or desire by the President to send troops to Ukraine. NATO is a forum to support our eastern flank partners and countries, and that's what the focus has been on.
What does this mean for Ukraine? If Russia invades, they will have to do the fighting. No NATO air support, no NATO battalions. It's all on them. So this just turned from a tag team contest into a one-on-one. Ukraine will have Western weapons, but no Western soldiers. Is this a green light for Putin to invade? After all, if NATO sits out, it's a no contest. Ukraine may resist for a while, but alone it cannot defeat the Russians. So what is Joe Biden's plan here? A strategy as old as ancient Greece. Economic sanctions, he says. They come in various forms: embargoes, asset freeze, blockades, denial of visas, many types, but the same objective: to cripple your rival's economy. Joe Biden plans to do the same with Russia. If Putin invades, he is threatening to impose severe economic sanctions, not just on the Russian economy, but on Vladimir Putin himself.
I made it clear to early on to President Putin that if he were to move into Ukraine, that there'd be severe consequences, including significant economic sanctions.
Would you ever see yourself personally sanctioning him if he did invade Ukraine?
Yes.
You would?
I would see that.
I know it sounds dramatic, but sanctioning Putin is a publicity stunt. Just think about it. It's not like Putin is vacationing in Florida or buying a condo in Manhattan. Sanctioning him is pointless. Sanctioning his economy is a better option any day. But even here, there is a caveat. You see, sanctions depend on two things. Number one, the power of the government imposing, and number two, the number of people joining it. In 2014, the West tried imposing sanctions on Russia. This was after the annexation of Crimea. Russian banks, oil companies, everything was sanctioned. More than 7 years later, what have those sanctions achieved? Nothing. We're on the brink of another Russian invasion. So this time, Biden is upping the ante. He's talking about sanctions that the world, quote unquote, has never seen before. It sounds great, but the fact is, Joe Biden cannot impose them alone. He needs American companies on board. He needs his European allies on board. The problem is, neither is enthusiastic. U.S. companies are asking Joe Biden to tone down the rhetoric. Here's what America's largest energy lobbyist has said. Sanctions should be as targeted as possible in order to limit potential harm to the competitiveness of U.S. companies. So saving Ukraine can wait. Their bottom lines are more important. Same with the European Union and European nations. They're okay with basic sanctions, but they do not want to push Russia beyond a point. And like we told you, basic sanctions do not work. Russia can simply spin the narrative. How's that? A, by looking for new markets. They can sell their energy to Iran or Venezuela or China. And B, by playing the victim card. Putin can galvanize his people by pointing to Western sanctions. It plays into his propaganda. The evil West hurting the Russian people. Simply put, sanctions do not work in a divided world. And that's where we are right now. A world split into three camps. The ones backing the US completely, the ones sitting on the fence, and the ones supporting Russia. This map should give you a better idea. These countries are America's die-hard backers: Canada, Britain, Denmark, Poland, and the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They are ready for extreme sanctions. On the other hand, these countries are supporting Russia. China, Iran, Venezuela, Belarus, and North Korea. These states do not care about Western sanctions, so they will keep trading with Russia. And finally, we have the undecided: Germany, Italy, Spain, France, Hungary, and Turkey. They want sanctions, but minor ones, nothing that will hurt their economies. So you have two factors working against sanctions: a profit-hungry corporate world and a divided Europe. And this is exactly why sanctions fail. I can give you multiple examples. Iran has been under sanctions since 1979. North Korea since the 1950s. I'm not saying these countries are flourishing. I'm saying those sanctions have failed. Both nations are building their nuclear arsenal. As I said, unity is key to any sanction, and right now the West is a divided bloc. Our next story will tell you why. The West is divided because Europe is afraid to take on Vladimir Putin. The reason is energy. A bulk of Europe's energy supplies come from Russia. We're talking about crude oil, natural gas, and solid fossil fuels. Russia has been an old, reliable supplier. The first imports date to the Soviet era in the 1970s. As of today, 40% of Europe's natural gas comes from Russia. And that's a lot of dependence. And there are no easy substitutes. What do you think will happen if Russia cuts off supply? Europe will freeze, forced to brave the winter without heat. The sheer prospect spells horror for them. Europe is already suffering a shortage, reeling from its worst energy crunch since the 1970s. It began last year. In 2021, gas prices in Europe shot up by 600%. You heard that right, 600%. Prices spiked due to a shortage, and they blamed Russia for it. Let me tell you what the head of the International Energy Agency has said. And I'm quoting, "We believe there are strong elements of tightness in the European gas market due to Russia's behavior. I would note that today's low Russian gas flows to Europe coincide with heightened geopolitical tensions over Ukraine." So was Europe's gas shortage engineered? Did Russia reduce supply to gain leverage over Brussels? This is a moment of realization for the European Union. They fear being arm twisted. EU policymakers say Russia could cut supplies again and split Europe over Ukraine further. There are 4 distinct scenarios that Europe fears if Russia invades Ukraine. Number 1 is financial sanctions on Russia. Western powers could unplug Russia from the global financial system, and Europe does not like the sound of it, because Russian banks use dollars and euros for energy transactions. If Russia is sanctioned, the transactions will be blocked. Scenario number 2, Russia could cut gas supplies itself. That would cripple Europe's energy systems, and that explains why they do not want to push Putin beyond a point. Scenario number 3, sanctions against Nord Stream 2. It's a multi-billion-dollar gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. If Russia invades Ukraine, this project, Nord Stream 2, will die a slow death. The West will be compelled to sanction Nord Stream, and you know what that means for Europe. An $11 billion project going down the drain. Also future energy supplies. Scenario number 4, Russia could cut off the Ukraine hub. Europe, you see, gets 1/3 of its Russian gas from Ukraine. The pipelines pass through Ukraine. This supply could become collateral damage if tensions escalate. So in all 4 situations, Europe will lose energy supplies from Russia, and that's why it is split over Ukraine. That's why some European countries do not want to pick a fight with Vladimir Putin. Russian energy supplies have hamstrung Europe, and the bloc only has itself to blame. It has failed to wean away from Russian energy. Europe has failed to replenish its gas and its gas reserves in the summer. But the bigger mistake was the failure to secure supply in the long term. For years, Europe has pushed for day-to-day spot pricing to buy gas. The better option is a long-term contract. Pick a supplier, fix a price, and extend a multi-year contract. But Europe does not do that. Last year, Vladimir Putin raised the same issue.
Over the past decade, step by step, systemic flaws have been laid in the European energy sector. It was they who have led to a large-scale market crisis in Europe.
To put it simply, Europe is caught between a rock and a hard place. If it backs Ukraine, it could lose Russian energy supplies. If it stays silent about Russia, it would lose face and moral high ground. The European Union would then have contributed to the weakening of a democratic state, maybe even its collapse. So what does Europe do? Look to the US for help. Washington is finalizing a plan. It wants to supply gas to Europe, but that is not going to be enough. The US, you see, has limited spare capacity. It cannot match the Russian supplies. So Europe has been forced to fire up its coal plants again, and that opens a whole new debate in countries preaching climate change to others. So if you're living in Europe, brace yourself. Pakistan is back at the bank. Same reason as always. They're running out of foreign exchange. But this time they're not asking the Saudis for money or negotiating with the IMF. This time they're selling Islamic bonds. How much money are we talking about? Around $1 billion. Pakistan desperately needed this money. And you know what they say about desperate borrowers? They're every lender's favorite. Let me tell you why. If you urgently need money, you cannot talk tough on interest rate. In other words, beggars cannot be choosers. Pakistan's Islamic bond is a perfect example. It has a maturity period of 7 years and the interest rate is 7.95%. I know these numbers may seem vague, so let me give you some context. Let's compare Pakistan's Islamic bond to America's Treasury bill. The Islamic bond has an interest rate of 7.95%. The US benchmark around 1.7%. This is the highest interest that Pakistan has ever paid on an Islamic bond. In 2014-15, it was 6.75%. In 2016, it was 5.5%, and now 7.95%. This rising interest rate is a sign of Pakistan's desperation. In the month of November, Saudi Arabia had loaned them $3 billion, out of which $2 billion has already been consumed. So this record Islamic bond was their only option. Technically, these bonds are supposed to be cheaper. What is an Islamic bond? It's supposed to comply with the Sharia law. It is supposed to offer lower interests, but not in the case of Pakistan. They're paying more interest than a normal government bond. As I said, beggars cannot be choosers. Also, bonds and loans will not solve Pakistan's problems. It's like a band-aid on a bullet wound. What Pakistan needs is a complete overhaul. It needs to address the root causes of economic failure like corruption. Pakistan is notorious for greasing the wheels. The latest report by Transparency International corroborates this. In 2020, Pakistan was ranked 124 out of 180 countries. In 2021, they fell 16 places from 124 to 140. This survey was carried out in 2020 and 2021. So the blame lies with Prime Minister Imran Khan. Remember, he came to power promising to clean up the country. So what does he plan to do now? Well, that depends on which Imran Khan you're talking to. Imran Khan, the opposition leader, loved Transparency International. Take a look.
एक साल में वही ट्रांसपेरेंसी इंटरनेशनल कहती है कि करप्शन पाकिस्तान में 20% बढ़ गई। पाकिस्तान की हुकूमत दुनिया की करप्ट तरीन हुकूमतों में ट्रांसपेरेंसी इंटरनेशनल के मुताबिक समझी जाती है। ट्रांसपेरेंसी इंटरनेशनल कहा है कि पाकिस्तान ने माशाल्लाह एक ही जगह तरक्की की और वो करप्शन में तरक्की की है। ट्रांसपेरेंसी इंटरनेशनल उसके मुताबिक पिछले 4 साल में पाकिस्तान में जो करप्शन और टैक्स की चोरी हुई वो है 8,500 अरब रुपया।
So it was a stump speech. Blame the generals, blame the government, talk about Transparency International. Speech done. But Imran, the Prime Minister, does not have anything to say. No comments, no promises to clean up, no reactions. Transparency International has not changed, but Imran Khan has. Like all his promises, this one too was fake. Pakistan's wheels are greasier than ever, and frankly, we should not be surprised. Imran Khan's own party is facing multiple corruption charges, illegal foreign funding, money laundering, concealment of bank accounts. If the Prime Minister cannot clean up his own party, how can he clean up the country? Opposition leaders are turning the heat on Imran Khan. On social media, he's the butt of every joke. He's being called corruption king. It's a truly precarious situation. Record inflation, empty treasury and rampant corruption. Prime ministers have been ousted over far less in Pakistan. And while Imran Khan refuses to speak up, some countries are being punished for the opposite, for standing firm and speaking out. I'm talking about Lithuania. We've told you about their crusade against China. Last year, Lithuania invited Taiwan to open an office in their capital. The office was named Taiwan, not Taipei, like its other offices in Europe and America. Needless to say, Beijing was livid. They responded with an illegal trade war on Lithuania. Their shipments to China fell 91% last month. 91% may seem like a huge blow, but let me put that number in context. China makes up only 1% of Lithuania's exports. Plus, Taiwan announced a $200 million fund for Lithuania. So technically, Lithuania could have survived this trade war, only if Europe had not played spoil sport. You see, Beijing knows it cannot hurt Lithuania directly, so it has changed its strategy. China is going after European multinational companies to target Lithuania. The plan is simple, I'll explain. China is offering two options to European companies. Either cut your ties with Lithuania or leave the Chinese market. In simple words, we call this blackmail. Some European firms are giving in to this pressure, especially the German car makers. BMW, Volkswagen, Continental, all of them import parts from Lithuania. But if they keep importing, they will be kicked out of the Chinese market. So these companies are asking Lithuania to climb down, to seek a compromise with China. Here's what the German Baltic Chamber of Commerce wrote. The basic business model of the companies is in question, and some will have no other option, no other choice than to shut down production in Lithuania. This is not trade. This is not diplomacy either. This is blackmail packaged as policy. We have international rules governing trade. We have a special organization to oversee it. It's called the World Trade Organization. China is flouting all of these norms to bully Lithuania. Their only hope is the European Union. Lithuania is a member of the EU. Together, the bloc can fight China's illegal blockade. But like always, the EU is divided on this one too. Their top trade official is hoping for a compromise with China. Compromise, no countermeasures, no statement of condemnation. The EU wants to end this controversy and end it quickly. All we can say is this: Lithuania tried. Unfortunately, they got no support from their so-called allies. After months of resisting Chinese high-handedness, reports say Lithuania could be seeking a compromise. Their plan is to rename Taiwan's office, change it from Taiwan to Taiwanese people. What difference would that make? Well, Taiwan refers to a political entity. They say it refers to political relations, but Taiwanese people refers to the public. It talks about cultural and economic exchanges. And Lithuania is hoping that this will satisfy Beijing. But the early indications are not good. Let me tell you what the Global Times wrote about this proposal, and I'm quoting: if Lithuania intends to mend its ties with China, it will take much more than just renaming the office. The key is whether the Lithuanian government can clearly recognize the reality. Lithuania needs to make substantial adjustments to its overall China policy. What more do the Chinese want? Well, to answer this, we must go back to May 2021. Lithuania had just pulled out of the 17+1 forum with China. And this was a huge blow for Beijing. 17+1 was a special forum including Eastern and Central European states, 12 EU members, 5 Balkan states and China. That makes it 17+1. This was the format. It was supposed to be China's gateway into Europe. But Lithuania spoiled that plan. Once they spoke out, others followed. Last week we told you about Slovenia. It's the same story. A small nation standing up to China. Lithuania to return to 2022, to return to 17+1. That's what Beijing wants. In fact, Beijing is making an example out of them. To reverse these setbacks, China wants Lithuania to return. And that's the kind of pressure that they're putting on the Lithuanian government. In fact, let me go back to the Global Times. This is what it says. It is time for those countries and their leaderships to think carefully. One cannot have access to China's huge market and investment by hurting Chinese people's feelings and supporting Taiwan's secession from China. Again, this is blackmail. Forget Taiwan or forget our money. That's what they're saying. Big European powers are doing nothing about this. Germany is not stopping its car makers. France is not offering Lithuania alternatives. All of them are keen on trading with China. They need Beijing's money more than Taiwan's friendship. We still don't know how this diplomatic row will end. As I said, reports say Lithuania will rename Taiwan's office, but Taiwan says no request has been made. Either way, this is another failure of the EU, another example of how Eastern and Central European nations are ignored by the likes of Germany and France. Lithuania's anti-China crusade did have momentum, but turns out the Pope in Brussels never blessed it. Let's turn to Australia now. And just like India, Australia too is observing a national holiday today. 26th of January is called Australia Day, the official national day for the country. It should be an occasion that unites the country. But every year, the deep divisions within Australia come to light on this day. There are protests on the streets because the indigenous community believes Australia is celebrating an invasion. Why is Australia Day so controversial? Our next report has the answers.
Australia Day is supposed to unite the country, but every year this day only exposes the divisions within Australia. These protests are proof. Here's the backstory. On the 26th of January 1788, the first British settlers arrived in Australia. They would set up a colony that would become Sydney. For some in Australia, this is reason to celebrate. But one indigenous community considers 26th January as a black day. They call it the anniversary of an invasion, one that led to the massacres of the Aboriginal people, and injustice that continues even today.
Australia Day is not the day to celebrate. Represents a day of mourning for Aboriginal people, and I don't think that it's right that we celebrate Australia Day on January 26th.
Many Indigenous Australians claim their ancestors lived on the continent 50,000 years ago. Every year they take to the streets to protest Australia Day. Today was no different. Major cities of Australia witnessed a protest rally. In the capital city of Canberra, protesters marched towards the Parliament House. They said the public holiday should be abolished.
About being here is firstly to show support for our Indigenous people who haven't been shown much support for our institutions, and on this particular day it's a terrible day to be naming as Australia Day. It's not appropriate. We need to change the date. We need to be more supportive and more accepting and more responsible for the way we've treated our Indigenous peoples for so long.
In Sydney too, protesters raised the same demand. In Melbourne, this statue was at the receiving end of public anger. It was defaced with red paint, and a demand to abolish Australia Day. This statue of British naval officer James Cook. He made the first recorded European contact with Australia's east coast in 1770. 8 years after contact, the British had arrived in Sydney. The date for Australia Day has always been contentious. However, the protesters remain in minority. A new poll says just 35% of Australians want the date to be considered as Invasion Day. But the anger in the Indigenous community cannot be ignored. It looks like Australia is still struggling with its colonial past. Bureau Report, World is One.
With that, it's a wrap. We're leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks for watching.
It's more for the simulation for